Welcome. This is the 11th session in our study of the books of Joshua and Judges. In this session, we're going to read chapters 15 through 18 of the book of Judges. We will finish the Samson cycle and hear a couple of stories that are not about Judges, but are important to the integrity of the book as a whole. The Samson stories are among the most well-known in the Old Testament. As we finish the second unit of these stories in chapter 15, we will see a link to what is called wisdom literature. Chapter 16 gives us the story of Samson and Delilah. But first, a word of prayer. O God, our Father, open our eyes and enlighten our minds as we study your word. So grant that our minds may know your truth, and our hearts may feel your love, and then confirm and strengthen our wills that we may go out to live what we have learned. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. So in our last session, we read the Annunciation narrative in which we heard about the birth of the Nazarite Samson in chapter 13. In chapter 14, we read the first part of the second unit of narratives about Samson. He chose a Philistine Timnite woman to marry, killed a lion with his bare hands, and later on ate honey from the carcass of that lion. He challenged members of the wedding party to solve a riddle that he had made up and became angry when his bride told them the answer. Yet the theme which ties the set of stories in chapters 14 and 15 together was found in the introduction. Verse 4 of the introduction told us, "His father and mother did not know that this was from the Lord, for he was seeking a pretext to act against the Philistines. Samuel only acted out of vengeance, usually involving a woman, and it was all part of the Lord's plan." This theme helps organize the stories of 14 and 15 into a coherent whole which distinguishes it from what precedes and follows. It's not clear that all of the stories in these two chapters originated from the same person or even from the same narrow circle. The fight over the Timnite woman motivates many of the stories, but she has disappeared as a factor by the end of chapter 15. In all but the last story, the numbers we hear are almost all multiples of 3, so watch for this. So we begin with chapter 15, verse 1. After a while, at the time of the wheat harvest, Samson went to visit his wife, bringing along a kid. He said, "I want to go into my wife's room," but her father would not allow him to go in. Her father said, "I was sure that you had rejected her, so I gave her to your companion. Is not her younger sister prettier than she? Why not take her instead?" Samson said to them, "This time, when I do mischief to the Philistines, I will be without blame." Samson has gone to the house of his wife's father, planning to sleep with his bride. But her father, thinking that Samson hated his daughter, denies him the opportunity. The father had 2 good reasons for thinking this. Back in chapter 14, Samson's angry declaration that his wife had been unfaithful with his 30 companions was the first one. The second would be his abrupt return to his own father's house at the end of that chapter. In verse 3, he seems to be addressing not only his father-in-law, but other Philistines he views as complicit in wrongdoing him. We go on to verse 4. So Samson went and caught 300 foxes and took some torches. And he turned the fox's tail to tail and put a torch between each pair of tails. When he had set fire to the torches, he let the foxes go into the standing grain of the Philistines and burned up the shocks and the standing grain, as well as the vineyards and olive groves. Then the Philistines asked, "Who has done this?" And they said, "Samson, the son-in-law of the Timnite, because he has taken Samson's wife and given her to his companion." So the Philistines came up and burned her and her father. Samson said to them, "If this is what you do, I swear I will not stop until I have taken revenge on you." He struck them down, hip and thigh, with a massive defeat, and he went down and stayed in the cleft of the rock of Etam. Like the 30 companions in chapter 14, we again see the numbers in multiples of 3, 300 foxes. Samson is repeatedly involved with animals, the lion, Now the foxes, and up next the jawbone of a donkey. In this case, the foxes running wild through the fields with their tails on fire are an effective delivery system for spreading incendiary destruction. Stacked grain, standing grain, vineyards, and olive trees cover most of the principal agricultural products of the region. The overall destruction is devastating. Let's go on to verse 9. Then the Philistines came up and encamped in Judah and made a raid on Lehi. The men of Judah said, "Why have you come up against us?" They said, "We have come up to bind Samson, to do him as he did to us." Then 3,000 men of Judah went down to the cleft of the rock of Etam, and they said to Samson, "Do you not know that the Philistines are rulers over us? What then have you done to us?" He replied, "As they did to me, so I have done to them." They said to him, "We have come down to bind you, so that we may give you into the hands of the Philistines." Samson answered them, "Swear to me that you yourselves will not attack me." They said to him, "No, we will only bind you and give you into their hands. We will not kill you." So they bound him with 2 new ropes and brought him up from the rock. So Lehi, the town in Judah, means jawbone. Samson is so powerful the Philistines think they need to bind him before they can kill him. Notice there are 3,000 Judeans. The Judeans bind him with ropes per the instructions of the Philistines. We go on to verse 14. When he came to Leah, the Philistines came shouting to meet him. The Spirit of the Lord rushed on him. The ropes that were on his arms became like flax that has caught fire, and his bonds melted off his hands. Then he found the fresh jawbone of a donkey, reached down and took it, and with it he killed 1,000 men. And Samson said, "With the jawbone of a donkey, heap upon heaps, with the jawbone of a donkey, I have slain 1,000 men." When he had finished speaking, he threw away the jawbone, and that place was called Ramath-leah. So Samson seals his conquest with a poem. Ramath-leah means casting of the jawbone. Let's go on to verse 18. By then he was very thirsty, and he called on the Lord, saying, "You have granted this great victory by the hand of your servant. Am I now to die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised?" So God split open the hollow place that is at Leah. The water came from it. When he drank, his spirit returned, and he revived. Therefore it was named En Hakkor, which is at Leah to this day. And he judged Israel in the days of the Philistines 20 years. En Hakkor means the spring of the one who calls out. Verse 20 tells us that Samson led or judged Israel 20 years. This sounds very much like the end of the Samson story, but it is in fact just the end of the second unit of stories. The first unit was the enunciation of his birth story in chapter 13. This verse ends the second unit of Samson's stories, which consists of chapters 14 and 15, and probably was intended as a conclusion. In general, the end of the story, with its strong theological coloring, Samson calling out to the Lord to quench his thirst, does not fully cohere with what precedes it. This suggests that these chapters incorporate a variety of stories from different oral traditions. These stories do have very close affinities to wisdom material and themes. In the introduction to chapter 14, we read that Yahweh, or the Lord, was seeking a pretext against the Philistines. The idea that Yahweh is in control, even when people appear to be acting of their own volition, characterizes wisdom literature. That is the main theme of Ecclesiastes, especially the famous chapter 3. There is a time for this and a time for that, which states that the cycles are all directed by God. And humans might try to understand the way they work, but to no avail. The riddles in Judges 14 and 15 are all in poetic parallelism, a form that characterizes the book of Proverbs, for example. We now go to chapter 16, which appears to be a late addition to the Samson cycle. In chapter 16, verses 4 through 31, the story of Samson and Delilah, is placed where it is because it is a story that explains the death of the super strong Samson. It is not clear that the first 3 verses of 16, the story of Samson and the prostitute from Gaza, were intended to be part of the Samson and Delilah story, or if they should be seen as a separate story. In any event, we begin chapter 16, verses 1 through 3. Once Samson went to Gaza, where he saw a prostitute and went to her. The Gazites were told, "Samson has come here." So they circled around and lay in wait for him all night at the city gate. They kept quiet all night, thinking, "Let us wait until the light of the morning, then we will kill him." But Samson lay only until midnight. Then at midnight he rose up, took hold of the doors of the city gate and the 2 posts, pulled them up, bar and all, put them on his shoulders, and carried them to the top of the hill that is in front of Hebron. This story is an echo of his first encounter with a Philistine woman, the Timnite woman. This story is also somewhat parallel to the story of the 2 spies who came to Rahab in Jericho in the book of Joshua. The difference being the spies came to spy and were concerned about their own safety. Samson comes only for his own pleasure and doesn't have to hide or flee because he can rely on his own strength. He is not worried about any plots against him. In carrying off the doors of the city gate, he not only asserts his own strength, but leaves the town exposed. We go on to verses 4 through 12. After this, he fell in love with a woman in the valley of Sorek, whose name was Delilah. The lords of the Philistines came to her and said to her, "Coax him and find out what makes his strength so great, and how we may overpower him, so that we may bind him in order to subdue him, and we will each give you 1,100 pieces of silver." So Delilah said to Samson, "Please tell me what makes your strength so great, and how you could be bound so that one could subdue you." Samson said to her, "If they bind me with 7 fresh bowstrings that are not dried out, then I shall become weak and be like anyone else." Then the lords of the Philistines brought her 7 fresh bowstrings that had not dried out, and she bound him with them. While the men were lying in wait in an inner chamber, she said to him, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." But he snapped the bowstrings as a strand of fiber snaps when it touches the fire. So the secret of his strength was not known. Then Delilah said to Samson, "You have mocked me and told me lies. Please tell me how you could be bound." He said to her, "If they bind me with new ropes that have not been used, then I shall become weak and be like anyone else." So Delilah took new ropes and bound him with them and said to him, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." The men lying in wait were in an inner chamber, but he snapped the ropes off his arms like thread. In this story about the 3rd woman, we are told that he actually loves the woman, and she actually has a name. The location now, Sorek, is in Israelite territory, and Delilah may well have been an Israelite woman. The overlords want him bound, not just so that they can kill him, but they want to torture him first. Presumably, she is putting this to Samson as merely a hypothetical condition, though it may also sound like some sort of a perverse sex game. Her first attempt at binding him didn't work, and we again hear the fire motif. So she tried again with the new ropes, and again he snaps the ropes like thread. We go on to verse 13. Then Delilah said to Samson, "Until now you have mocked me and told me lies. Tell me how you could be bound." And he said to her, "If you were to weave 7 locks of my head with the web and make it tight with the pin, then I shall become weak and be like anyone else." So while he slept, Delilah took the 7 locks of his head and wove them into the web and made them tight with the pin. Then she said to him, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." But he awoke from his sleep and pulled away the pin, the loom, and the web. Then she said to him, "How can you say I love you when your heart is not with me? You have mocked me 3 times now and have not told me what makes your strength so great?" Finally, after she had nagged him with her words day after day and pestered him, he was tired to death. So he told her his whole secret and said to her, "A razor has never come upon my head, for I have been a Nazarite to God from my mother's womb. If my head were shaved, then my strength would leave me. I would become weak and be like anyone else." In verse 15, Delilah says, "How can you say I love you when your heart is not with me?" Using the same feminine argument as the Timnite woman. Again, here is the term three. 3 times, as in the pattern of 3 times with a fourth that swerves to a new outcome. 3 women and the multiples of 3 killed by Samson. Verses 18 through 22. When Delilah realized he had told her his whole secret, she sent and called the lords of the Philistines, saying, "This time come up, for he has told his whole secret to me." Then the lords of the Philistines came up to her and brought the money in their hands. She let him fall asleep on her lap, and she called a man and had him shave off the 7 locks of his head. He began to weaken, and his strength left him. Then she said, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." When he woke from his sleep, he thought, "I will go out as at the other times and shake myself free." But he did not know that the Lord had left him. So the Philistines seized him and gouged out his eyes. They brought him down to Gaza and bound him with bronze shackles. And he ground at the mill in the prison. But the hair of his head began to grow again after it had been shaved. Rhetorically, a big chunk of this unit is also fundamentally different than the earlier units. 16:6 through 20 uses the common biblical 3-4 pattern to describe how Delilah tries to discover the sources of Samson's power. She fails the first 3 times and succeeds on the 4th. This section is typified by a repetition with variations as it leads up to a climax where Samson reveals his secret. This style is fundamentally different from what precedes it. It is neither folkloristic like chapter 13, nor typical of wisdom literature like chapters 14 and 15. In this last section, we have the powerful image of the seductive woman lulling the mighty hero and reducing him to a baby in her lap. So we go on, verse 23. Now the lords of the Philistines gathered to offer a great sacrifice to the god Dagon and to rejoice, for they said, "Our God has given Samson, our enemy, into our hands." When the people saw him, they praised their God, for they said, "Our God has given our enemy into our hands, the ravager of our country, who has killed many of us." And when their hearts were merry, they said, "Call Samson and let him entertain us." So they called Samson out of the prison, and he performed for them. They made him stand between the pillars, and Samson said to the attendant who held him by the hand, "Let me feel the pillars on which the house rests, so that I may lean against them." Now the house was full of men and women, and the lords of the Philistines were there. And on the roof there were about 3,000 men and women who looked on while Samson performed. We read there are 3,000 men and women who are watching Samson perform, including all the Philistine overlords. We're not sure what kind of a performance this was. He may have been dancing, or maybe just a blind man stumbling about while the audience laughs. Anyway, verse 28. Then Samson called to the Lord and said, "Lord God, remember me and strengthen me only this once, O God, so that with this one act of revenge I may pay back the Philistines for my 2 eyes." And Samson grasped the 2 middle pillars on which the house rested, and he leaned his weight against them, his right hand on the one and his left hand on the other. Then Samson said, "Let me die with the Philistines." He strained with all his might, and the house fell on the lords and on all the people who were in it. So those he killed at his death were more than those he had killed during his life. Then his kindred and all his family came down and took him and brought him up and buried him between Zorah and Eshtaol in the tomb of his father Manoah. He had judged Israel 20 years. In this last moment, Samson turns again in prayer to God, but even now his motive is personal vengeance. We see now why the messenger of the Lord prophesied that Samson would no more than begin to rescue Israel from the Philistines. Samson's career as an Israelite champion ends in an act of wholesale destruction in which he too dies, like the fire that consumes everything in its path and eventually itself as well. The three units of Samson's cycle use different styles and tend to emphasize different values. We can only summarize that the types of changes that are called for to create a truly coherent cycle went beyond what a biblical redactor would typically do. Instead, the stories were brought together in chronological order. This is the major factor that allows these originally separate stories to cohere somewhat. In the earliest stage of the cycle, a birth story, chapter 13, was followed by the stories of the exploits of the mature Samson, chapters 14 and 15. When material concerning the death of Samson became available for inclusion in the book, chapter 16, it was added at the end. Chapter 17 is a little short story about a man from Ephraim named Micah. Micah is not a judge, but his story ties in with the story of Samson as well as the narrative that follows. So we begin chapter 17, verses 1 through 6. There was a man in the hill country of Ephraim whose name was Micah. He said to his mother, "The 1,100 pieces of silver that were taken from you, about which you uttered a curse and even spoke it in my hearing, that silver is in my possession. I took it, but now I will return it to you." And his mother said, "May my son be blessed by the Lord." Then he returned the 1,100 pieces of silver to his mother, and his mother said, "I consecrate the silver to the Lord from my hand to my son to make an idol of cast metal." So when he returned the money to his mother took 200 pieces of silver and gave it to the silversmith, who made it into an idol of cast metal, and it was in the house of Micah. This man Micah had a shrine, and he made an ephod and a teraphim, and installed one of his sons who became his priest. In those days there was no king in Israel. All the people did what was right in their own eyes. The two narratives in chapters 17 and 18, and again in chapters 19 through 21, constitute a kind of epilogue to the book of Judges, illustrating the general condition of moral and political anarchy in the period before the monarchy. We notice that the 1,100 silver shekels in this story is the precise amount that each of the Philistine overlords paid Delilah, and in both cases it is a kind of silver that leads to disaster. Micah's mother had uttered a curse on whoever had stolen the silver, and apparently it frightened him so that he gave it back. The mother, again unnamed, declares the silver to the Lord, but plans to use some of the silver to create an idol. Verse 6 reminds us, in those days there was no king in Israel. All the people did what was right in their eyes. Let's go on to verse 7. There was a young man of Bethlehem in Judah, of the clan of Judah. He was a Levite residing there. This man left the town of Bethlehem in Judah to live wherever he could find a place. He came to the house of Micah in the hill country of Ephraim to carry on his work. Micah said to him, "From where do you come?" He replied, "I am a Levite of Bethlehem in Judah, and I am going to live wherever I can find a place." Then Micah said to him, "Stay with me and be to me a father and a priest, and I will give you 10 pieces of silver a year, a set of clothes, and your living." The Levite agreed to stay with the man, and the young man became to him like one of his sons. So Micah installed the Levite, and the young man became his priest, and was in the house of Micah. Then Micah said, "Now I know that the Lord will prosper me, because the Levite has become my priest." A Levite from the clan of Judah looks like a contradiction here. It's been proposed that this story goes back to some earlier moment in Israelite history when the Levite's tribal identity may not have crystallized yet, and Levite may be the designation of some kind of a cultic official. Father in this context means someone in a position of authority. In fact, the Levite is a lad, a generation younger than Micah. With this, we move on to chapter 18, but not forgetting Micah and the Levite. This is part 2 of the same narrative, chapter 18, verses 1 through 6. In those days, there was no king in Israel, and in those days the tribe of Danites was seeking for itself a territory to live in. For until then, no territory among the tribes of Israel had been allotted to them. So the Danites sent 5 valiant men from the whole number of their clan from Zorah and from Eshtaol to spy out the land and to explore it. And they said to them, "Go explore the land." When they came to the hill country of Ephraim, to the house of Micah, they stayed there. While they were at Micah's house, they recognized the voice of a young Levite. So they went over and asked him, "Who brought you here? What are you doing in this place? What is your business here?" He said to them, "Micah did such and such for me, and he hired me, and I have become his priest." Then they said to him, "Inquire of God, that we may know whether the mission we are undertaking will succeed." The priest replied, "Go in peace. The mission you are on is under the eye of the Lord." Again, in verse 1, we are reminded that there is no king in Israel. This is beginning to look like a theme. If you remember back in Joshua, Dan was indeed given a territory on the coast of the Mediterranean, northeast of Judah, but just north of the Philistines. They were unable to hold their own against the Philistine neighbors and the local Canaanites, and so were driven to migrate. We're told that they recognized the voice of the Levite lad, perhaps. Given his itinerancy, maybe they had actually run across him somewhere else in the south. We also notice that the Levite is not making any promises here. He is a little ambiguous, like oracles everywhere. The Levite is hedging his bets. So we go on to verses 7 through 13. The 5 men went on, and when they came to Laish, they observed the people who were there living securely, after the manner of the Sidonians, quiet and unsuspecting, lacking nothing on earth and possessing wealth. Furthermore, they were far from the Sidonians and had no dealings with Aram. When they came to their kinfolk at Zorah and Eshtaol, they said to them, "What do you report?" They said, "Come, let us go up against them, for we have seen the land, and it is very good. Will you do nothing? Do not be slow to go, but enter in and possess the land. When you go, you will come in to an unsuspecting people. The land is broad. God has indeed given it into your hands, a place where there is no lack of anything on earth." 600 men of the Danite clan, armed with weapons of war, set out from Zorah and Eshtaol, and went up and encamped at Kiriath Jearim in Judah. On this account, that place is called Menah Dan to this day. It is west of Kiriath Jearim. From there they passed on to the hill country of Ephraim and came to the house of Micah. Laish was isolated and had no allies on which to rely, living there securely in verse 7 and unsuspecting in verse 10 indicates they live in a sense of security, not suspecting that they will be attacked. Let's go on to verse 14. Then the 5 men who had gone to spy out the land, that is Laish, said to their comrades, "Do you know that in these buildings there are an ephod, teraphim, and an idol of cast metal? Now therefore consider what you will do." So they turned in that direction and came to the house of the young Levite at the home of Micah and greeted him. While the 600 men of the Danites, armed with their weapons of war, stood by the entrance of the gate, the 5 men who had gone to spy out the land proceeded to enter and take the idol of cast metal ephod and the teraphim. The priest was standing by the entrance of the gate with the 600 men armed with weapons of war. When the men went to Micah's house and took the idol of cast metal, the ephod of the teraphim, the priest said to them, "What are you doing?" They said to him, "Keep quiet. Put your hand over your mouth and come with us and be to us a father and a priest. It is better for you to be a priest in the house of one person or to be a priest to a tribe and a clan in Israel." Then the priest accepted the offer. He took the ephod, the teraphim, and the idol and went along with the people. Understanding the implied threat, basically, shut up if you know what's good for you. Of course, the inducement of an offered position didn't hurt either. Nobody in the story, beginning with Micah and his mother has noble motives. The Levite happily colludes with the theft of the cultic articles. So let's go on to verse 21. So they resumed their journey, putting the little ones, the livestock, and the goods in front of them. When they were some distance from the home of Micah, the men who were in the house of Micah's house were called out, and they overtook the Danites. They shouted to the Danites, who turned around and said to Micah, "What is the matter that you come with such a company?" He replied, "You take my gods that I made and the priest and go away, and what have I left? How then can you ask me what is the matter?" The Danites said to him, "You had better not let your voice be heard among us, or else hot-tempered fellows will attack you, and you will lose your life and the lives of your household." Then the Danites went their way. When Micah saw that they were too strong for him, he turned and went back to his home. This story plays out through force. Micah can scarcely contend with the 600 heavily armed, ruthless men who have just threatened to kill him and his whole household. So he lets them keep these objects that they have stolen from him, which he had fashioned with silver that he originally stole from his mother. Let's go on to verse 27. The Danites, having taken what Micah had made, and the priest who belonged to him, came to Lash, to a people quiet and unsuspecting, put them to the sword, and burned down the city. There was no deliverer because it was far from Sidon, and they had no dealings with Aram. It was in the valley that belongs to Beth-Rob. They rebuilt the city and lived in it. They named the city Dan after their ancestor Dan, who was born to Israel. But the name of the city was formerly Lash. Then the Danites set up their idol for themselves. Jonathan, son of Gershom, son of Moses, and his sons were priests to the tribe of the Danites until the time the land went into captivity. So they maintained as their own Micah's idol that he had made as long as the house of God was at Shiloh. So no moral considerations are involved at all here. These people have attractive land. Dan needs land. The Danites slaughter the inhabitants of Lash and build their own town. Placing the Levite just 2 generations after Moses would mean that the whole story is supposed to take place very early, at the beginning of the 12th century BCE, a temporal location that has the inconvenient consequence of putting the Danite migration before the time of Samson, a Danite living in the south near the Philistines. In verse 20, we are told that they remained until the time the land went into captivity, which would have been the exile of the northern kingdom of Israel by the Assyrians in 721 BCE. Which means the final formulation of this story would have been sometime after that date. The mention of Shiloh at the end here is probably an editorial move to link the material here with the beginning of the book of Samuel, where Shiloh plays a central role. In session 12, we read chapters 19 through 21. The theme we have seen about having no king in Israel continues. Infighting becomes progressively worse until it erupts in civil war. The conclusion to the book of Judges is not a pretty one, but we still have opportunity to learn. I hope you can join us at our discussion Monday evening. If you need to, send an email to online.classes@northgateumc.org to get the Zoom link. Have a good week.